So if you remember, what we've been talking about is Paul in his trek going up to Rome. And so what we saw in chapter 24 was Paul before Felix. And today we're going to be talking about Paul before Festus. So Festus was the next Roman governor that succeeded Felix. And what we see as far as just, history goes is that Felix kind of got himself in a little bit of hot water with Caesar and with the Jews. And, that may be a reason why, if you remember, Felix left Paul detained there in Caesarea because he was trying to do the Jews a favor. Maybe he was trying to do that is because, he wasn't really in too good with Caesar very much because of what the Jews were telling Caesar. And a couple of years of that, he got recalled to Rome because of all that. And this other guy, Porcius Festus, succeeded him as governor. And what history says about Festus is that he was not like Felix at all. He was somebody who was a pretty capable governor and, at least had some sense and sensibility about him. Here we were talking about wonders being, is there any wisdom in Washington? Well, I guess that goes along with government down throughout the ages, right? But it seems, from what we kind of see here and what we see, from history is that Festus was a pretty good governor as far as just being a pretty decent man, not being corrupt, somebody who was pretty fair-handed, fair, even dealing with people. And we kind of see this a little bit with Paul. Not saying he was a good guy by any stretch of the imagination, but, we can at least see that when we take a look at chapter 25 tonight. Okay? So, what we see, starting in the first couple of verses, as a matter of fact, what we see from looking at this whole chapter, we can kind of look at it in three different parts. We can see Paul's trial before Festus, and then we see that Festus discusses his case with another guy, King Agrippa, and then finally what we see is that Paul is now going to start to stand before King Agrippa. So this chapter, at least the last part of this chapter, is kind of a segue into chapter 26. Okay? So, taking a look at the first 12 verses, what we see that in verses 1 through 5 is that the Jews had a certain request to Festus, and we see that Festus answers him. So in chapter 25 and verse number 1, it says, 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him, and they presented the charges against Paul. They urgently requested Felix as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they are preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. You remember those 40 men who took that vow? It's been 2 years now, so, they promised that they wouldn't eat anything or drink anything until Paul was dead. Don't think that they made it this long, but even though that the following of it wasn't there, the intent was there, right? They still wanted Paul dead, and so they were going to, wait and see if we could get Paul just to come back to Jerusalem. Then we can get close enough and we can ambush him and we can kill him. So, you think about Festus and you think about, the new guy on the job. Man, here they are just testing the new guy right off the bat, right? And so, here he is. Oh, we've got this guy up there in your palace, Festus. His name's Paul, and we would really, really like it if you brought him down to Jerusalem. I mean, that would be a great thing. If you really want to do us a favor, if you really want to prove yourself to be a good governor, then why don't you come down and, let Paul come face charges here. After all, that other guy, Felix, we had him here in Jerusalem, and he got taken up there, and Felix wouldn't, let him come down here for trial. So we're just really, really urging you. Okay, so you get the idea of how, some of the things that they might have been saying to get Paul down into Jerusalem, not really to face the charges, but to killing him along the way. Well, what we see is that, and this is what I'm saying, is that Festus had a little bit of sense about him, right? He says in verse number 4, Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there if he has done anything wrong. And so I kind of think that, maybe Festus kind of had a feeling about what they were doing and, knew that, hey, this isn't anything to give into. I'm going there myself. If you guys want to press charges, then just come with me, Notice he's not telling them no, but at the same time, he's definitely not telling them yes, right? If what you really want to do is press charges against this man, Paul, then you can press charges against him in Caesarea. You can do that just the same in Caesarea as you can in Jerusalem. You don't have to have him transferred to Jerusalem to do that. He's already there. I'm going there too. You can go with me, and we can all go and we can get this together. So you kind of see that, this man right off the bat, he's got a little bit of sense to him anyway. And so what we see in the next couple of verses, in verse 6 through 8, is that this takes place. We see that the leaders go up to Jerusalem. And in verse number 6, it says, after spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. So when Paul appeared, the Jews had come down from Jerusalem, stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. By the way, I ask you again, what charges were leveled against Paul?
None.
Well, there were some. I mean, when they had him stand trial before Felix, you remember that the lawyer Tertullus kind of did bring some charges. He said, we found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple, so we seized him. Okay, so as far as, starting riots over the world, no, he didn't do that. And Felix knew he didn't do that. As far as desecrating the temple, he didn't do that either.
But yeah, couldn't find anything to charge him with.
Well, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that. We're getting ahead of ourselves here, Paul. You must have read the chapter in advance. So I'm going to have to tell everybody, yeah, read chapter 25, except Paul. Don't read chapter 25, Paul. No. But, so as far as charges go, those charges really weren't there. I mean, that was not anything that was really found. That was things that were concocted, right? And so where it says in this chapter before Festus that here they are producing these charges, many serious charges against Paul, we really don't know what those charges are, right? We don't have a good indication from this verse what is being said about all of this. The only thing that's said is just simply which they could not prove. And so here's the idea again, that here they are pressing all of these very serious charges to put Paul to death, but they can't prove any of them, okay? And at the same time, what we see is that Paul is giving his defense about all of this. As we take a look at verse number 8, then Paul made his defense, I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. And so, Paul is in his defense. I mean, I don't know exactly what he's saying to all these charges, except, we can see that if these charges that they're bringing are against, Paul is being disloyal with Caesar. Paul's saying, no, I'm not. If he's being disloyal or defiling the temple, no, I'm not. If he is doing things against the law of the Jews, no, I'm not. So, he could just say, I'm not doing any of these things. You can't prove it. I'm not doing any of these, right? Okay. So after he made all of that, what we see is that then Festus goes and makes his decision as a judge. And his decision as a judge is just simply this. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, maybe he doesn't have a whole lot of sensibility. Now he's acting like a politician, isn't he? Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges?" Now what? I mean, it's kind of like, if you're Paul, aren't I already being tried on these charges? Why do I have to go there to be tried on these charges? I'm here before you, Festus, being tried on these charges. These guys can't prove any of these charges. And so how is it anything is going to change if I go down to Jerusalem, right? Does that seem fair and reasonable to you? It doesn't really seem that fair or reasonable to me either, right? But again, the reason why Festus is asking this question is because he wants to do the Jews a favor. Now he's kind of saying, here is something, and what we're going to see later on is that he really doesn't understand the case. He doesn't understand the charges. He doesn't understand what's going on. Maybe he's doing this because he's thinking, if I send him down there, then we can have another, and I can figure this out before I get there so I don't look like an idiot by saying, I don't understand what you guys are talking about, But at the same time, he's thinking, well, that'll take care of the problem of the Jews, and I can, do them a favor and take Paul down to Jerusalem. And so what is going to happen? If Paul goes down to Jerusalem, we know what's going to happen. He's going to get ambushed. He's going to get killed. And I think that Paul understands that too. If Paul were to go to Jerusalem, then it's no longer going to be in a Roman court. Even though Festus is going to be there presiding over it, what it's going to be is more of a Jewish court, and he's going to be charged under like Jewish law, and it's going to be more difficult for him to get out of it, even if he were to get that far, which the Jews had intended to kill him. And so what he says in verse 10 is this: I am now standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. Okay? So why should Paul have been tried in Caesar's court? Because he's a Roman, number one, but number two, who was the one that really apprehended him?
Roman soldiers.
The Roman soldiers did. Okay? They were rescuing from the Jews, but that was not, officers and policemen, anything like that. That was a mob that was trying to kill him. And so, he needed to be in Caesar's court. The Romans apprehended him, and so that automatically put him in Roman jurisdiction. He was a Roman citizen, and so that automatically put him in Roman jurisdiction. By him going and saying, okay, I'm going to go down to Jerusalem, well, he's going back, to where he came from. And so he says, I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, in verse number 11, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. So he's saying, I'm not just trying to weasel my way out of here. He's accepting if I've done anything wrong, I'll face the consequences. But he says this. He says, but if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. Now that does make sense, doesn't it? Since because he's a Roman citizen, because he's in Caesar's court, these charges aren't true anyway. Festus knows they're not true. And so because of that, no, he's not going to go back to Jerusalem. So look at the place that he's in, right? He's been in Felix's jurisdiction. And what has happened while he's been in Felix's jurisdiction? Nothing. He's stuck, isn't he? He's stuck because Felix isn't willing to release him, and Felix is not, want to take him down there. So Felix just, got him in kind of a limbo state. He pretty much is falling into the same course of action with Festus, isn't he? If you're not willing to go down to Jerusalem, well, then there's not a whole lot Festus can do for you, because, if he is willing to take him down there to do a favor for the Jews, then he is certainly not willing to let him go. Instead, he's going to just simply keep him right there, locked up. And so what does he do? He says this: I appeal to Caesar. Okay? Now, this is a big deal, and this really kind of does a couple of different things. First of all, by appealing to Caesar, he is definitely wanting to advance his case forward. Every Roman citizen had the right to have their case heard by Caesar or one of Caesar's representatives. And so, by Paul saying, I'm going to appeal to Caesar, he is now advancing his case up the chain. That is kind of a risky proposition because do you know who the Caesar was at that time? His name began with an N, Nero. Nero. Now, who was Nero to the Christian as far as Christian fame? He was the first Caesar to initiate persecutions against the Christians. Okay, now this is going to happen later on down the road, obviously, but you can see that Caesar's not really a fan of Christians automatically, and he is kind of a psychotic, psychopath, murderous thug. Okay, so it's kind of like, do you really want to have your case heard by somebody like that? So it's a little bit of a risky proposition, isn't it? In that regards. But where was Paul supposed to go? This is the second part of it, okay? Where was Paul supposed to go? Where did God want him? Rome, okay? We found that way back in chapter 19, didn't we? We found that way back in chapter 21 when Jesus said, you must testify about me in Rome. They're stuck in Caesarea. He's not going anywhere, even though he needs to go to Rome. And so now all of a sudden, this is a perfect opportunity for Paul to say, yeah, I'm going to go to Rome. Okay? Now, think about this. If he goes to Rome, is he going to accomplish God's will for his life? Yes, he is, because God wants him in Rome, right? But at the same time, what happens if all of a sudden it doesn't go too well for him? And he winds up being put to death? I think a lesson that we can learn here is that sometimes we need to look at, we think about doing the Lord's will and doing the Lord's will. Sometimes the Lord's will isn't very clear cut, but sometimes the Lord's will is very clear cut. When we have, through the Word of God, we have principles and we have commands in place that God wants us to live our lives by. Now, when we look at them, we say, okay, how are we going to accomplish those principles? And, sometimes the Lord will present ways for us to do those things. And, we could say, okay, that's automatically there. But in doing that, there is sometimes that we can wind up putting ourselves at risk as well. Okay? So what does that mean? Does that mean we should not do what God wants for us to do, or we should not take the steps necessary for the Lord's will to be accomplished because we don't want to put our necks out on the chopping block? If we had courage, right, and if we had conviction that this is what God wants for us in our lives, then we should also have the faith to say, okay, God, this is what you want. I see this is the means that you're getting there. And so therefore, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to put myself in your hands, right? Which, when you think about it, that's a pretty scary proposition unless you stop and think, well, wait a minute, putting ourselves in God's hands is a pretty good place to be, isn't it? Because God is very capable, and God is very capable of taking care of us. And even if it meant that Paul was going to die, later on in the book of Philippians, while he was in Rome, he didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know if he was going to be put to death. He didn't know if he was going to be released. But he did know that if he died, it meant gain for him. And it also meant that if he was released, it meant that he could go on and do some things for the Lord. And so what he chose to do, he didn't know, because, it's kind of a win-win either way you go. Sometimes I think we need to remember that too, is that when you look at a broader perspective, broader horizon, past the problems that might come from us doing what God wants is that, yeah, we're on the winning side of that, winning side of the equation. Anybody got any questions on that? Any comments on that? No? Okay. So now starting in verse number 13, we hit this second little part, and that is now we are introduced to this other guy, this King Agrippa. Now, who was King Agrippa? King Agrippa is one of the Herods, okay? As a matter of fact, King Agrippa, this is King Agrippa II, by the way, Herod Agrippa II, is the great-grandson of Herod the Great, and that is the Herod that wanted to kill all the babies in Bethlehem, okay? And so you got a lot of different Herods down through the New Testament. All of them were pretty bad guys, and this is the great-grandson of the guy that started it all back in the book of Matthew chapter 1, okay? Or Matthew chapter 2. So here we've got this King Agrippa. Now, a couple of, told you a little bit of historical facts about Festus. Let me tell you a couple of historical facts about Agrippa. Agrippa became king when he was 17 years old. And because he was 17 years old, he was too young to really wield any sort of power. And so he was just kind of there until he got older. And as he got older, then Caesar, because after all, Caesar is the one who has the real power, right? King Agrippa, yeah, the only power he's got is the power that Caesar was allowing him to have. And so when he started to get a little bit older, Caesar started to give him a little bit more of a little bit power, okay? And so here we've got this King Agrippa, and we've got Festus, and Festus is the new governor on the block. And so it just makes sense that as the new governor on the block, first of all, he goes down to Jerusalem. And so he spends some time there, kind of getting to know folks, getting his feet wet, getting adjusted. Goes back, and now we've got somebody else, some governor, from the government, King Agrippa, is coming to pay his respects and start to get to know him and everything like that, okay? Now, King Agrippa also has somebody in tow whose name is Bernice. Bernice is not his wife. Bernice is his sister, okay? So, just, little, Ben, I think I know what you're thinking. And other people thought the same thing. And so, Bernice was actually married to this other guy. That didn't work out, and so she broke up. She ran home and went to live with brother. And people started to say, "Hey, this is a little interesting." And when they started to get wind of that, they said, "Well, maybe you need to go get married to somebody else to put the rumors to rest." She wound up going and marrying somebody else, and then after a while, that broke up. And she went back, brother. And then at some point in her life, she became a mistress to one of Caesar's sons. And that's about all that I know about her. But anyway, there's Bernice, okay? All right, another fine branch of the tree of Herod, okay? Okay, so what we see in verse number 13 through verse number 17 is Festus arrives in... I'm sorry, I've got Jerusalem on my sheet, but it's Caesarea. Oh, I'm sorry. So what happens? I better start reading my sheet and understand what's going on. Festus is there, and he wants to talk to Agrippa about this, and he is discussing what happened when he was back in Jerusalem. Okay, got that right. Verse number 13, it says, a few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived in Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, there's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I came to Jerusalem, the chief priest and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. Okay, so we know that, when they were there in Jerusalem, hey, we want him killed. Okay, so verse number 16, what we see is he says, I told them that is not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he has faced his accusers and had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. When they came here with me, I could not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. And so what we see is that in verse number 18 is that this is the synopsis of the case so far. In verse number 18 it says, when his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I'd expected. Here's this guy that they want to be executed. Oh, okay, he's a murderer. No. Oh, he's a rapist. No. He's trying to overthrow the Roman government. No. Well, what is he being charged with? Here we come back to that question, right? Okay. So what they were accusing him of was something that Festus was really caught off guard. And so he says in verse number 19, instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. Okay? And so you can see that, from an outsider's perspective, who really didn't understand Christianity, didn't know Christianity, just walking into the middle of this dispute between the Jews and Paul, you can kind of see that he's really perplexed about this whole thing, right? Because after all, when Paul went to the Sanhedrin, what happened there? I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and I stand today in hope of the resurrection. And then, boom, everything broke loose, right? Okay. Well, obviously, when the Jewish leaders went there, there probably wasn't any Pharisees that were there. And so Paul probably could have pressed that point a little bit more, right? Because if anything came out of the Sanhedrin, that's what came out of the Sanhedrin. And that's what Paul was wanting to make this about, was about his belief in Jesus Christ. And so, they could have been making charges of, this man disobeys the law, this man is, desecrated the temple. And Paul could have been really pressing him and having a theological debate over whether he really did desecrate the temple and whether or not he really was disobeying the law and what the law was all about and what his life was about and about the resurrection of the dead. Well, here the Sadducees said there is no resurrection of the dead. And so can you see how all of this is probably going on? And Festus is probably like, wait a minute, I'm probably missing something, right? Now, put yourself in Festus's perspective here, okay? What he needs to do is he's going to send this man on to Caesar. On what charges? And what's this about? I mean, if you're sending this case on to Caesar, don't you want to make sure that you don't look like an idiot? It kind of would be helpful, wouldn't it? So he says in verse number 20, I was at a loss to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial on these charges. Then Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision. I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. Okay, and this is really what Festus was wanting to do. This is more than just simply Agrippa's curiosity. If you think about the politics of this, this is a way for Festus to kind of get in, good with Agrippa and form a relationship. I read not too long ago just a little article about making friends. Maybe I need to do a better job making friends. It's just saying, how do you meet somebody and develop a friendship and a relationship with them? And the one thing that the author of this article, I can't remember where it is I read this, but I hadn't even thought about this before, was to ask them for a favor. And I never thought about that before because, I always don't ask favors of people to make friendships. Maybe that's why I don't have a lot of friends. But I would think it's the opposite way, right? Oh, hey, I need you to do a favor. I need you to do a favor. I need you to do a favor for me. Oh man, this guy's, well, okay. But really, they're saying, if you ask somebody for a favor, you can develop a relationship with them because they start to become helpful and they start to feel good that, they're being helpful. And then, you open yourself up for them to return a favor. So, here's Festus. He's the new kid, right? And so if he's going to be asking Agrippa for a little bit of a favor, that would be good for him. And plus, it's giving Agrippa a little bit of standing. You remember where he came from. You know, he's pretty much of a newbie himself. He's, you know, wanting power, but he doesn't have a whole lot of power at this point. And so, you know, anything that the Roman governor is coming to me, you know, he wants to chip in on, okay? So you can see it's kind of a win-win situation here, all right, in terms of Agrippa going and, you know, making this case. And so what we see is that starting in verse number 23 is just this introductory, you know, this is the next day, or the next day, everything's there. We got the big pomp, we got the big circumstance. It's just the introduction before chapter 26. And what we see in verse number 23 is the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered into the audience room with the high-ranking officials and the leading men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought before him. So you can see this is a real dog and pony show, right? Okay. And so Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man who was... King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man, the whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought to not live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. Well, isn't that kind of interesting? If you decided he wasn't guilty of anything, why is he still there? Good point, right? Okay. But again, he's like, okay, well, you know, it almost sounds like, you know, I would have let him go, but he'd appealed to Rome. So because he appealed to Rome, this is where we're at right now. So we see that he says in verse number 26, but I have nothing definite to write about to His Majesty about him. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I might have something to write, for I think that it is unreasonable to send a prisoner without specifying the charges against him. You think? Again, I ask, what charges were against Paul? Still very unclear, right? Even Festus realized it was unclear. All right. Anybody got, we're done with chapter 25, so anybody got any questions or comments about anything? Yeah.
Can you explain again to me the hierarchy? Because you said Caesar was giving, but I can't remember now. Whoever is in charge. So was it King Agrippa that Caesar was giving a little more power to? So Caesar's over King Agrippa?
Caesar's over everybody. Okay? So Caesar is Caesar, and we've got the Roman appointed governor, who is Festus. Okay? Before him is Felix, and before him is, I don't know who, but, you know, on down the line to Pilate. Okay? And so, you know, Rome, in situations, if a province behaved themselves, then, you know, you could pretty much have the province just govern themselves. But if you had provinces that were a little bit more trouble to be loyal to Rome, then you'd oftentimes have governors there. And so, you know, depending on the level of loyalty of the provinces, you know, depend on how much power those governors had. And so, you know, like Pilate, and, you know, he had a lot of power because it was very troublesome at that time. You know, Felix and Festus, they had a lot of power too because of that. Now, okay, so that's, you know, on the Roman side of things. But then you've got on the other side of things. And so the other side of things are the rulers themselves. You know, this would have been the kings. This would have been, you know, everything like that. And so in this case, you've got the high priest. That's why the high priests are in charge. But at the same time, you've got kings. And like the Herods, they were kind of partial Jews. They wanted to be called the king of the Jews. They wanted to rule over that whole area. But the problem is the Jews really didn't want him to rule over the whole area. And so, you had a little bit of a power struggle between the house of Herod and the Jewish religious leadership of the high priest and the Sanhedrin and everything like that. This is a lot of dirty politics back in that day and time, just like in today's day and time. Now, Herod's going to be on all of them. So Herod's going to be appointing the governor. Herod is actually going to be appointing chief priests, or at least allowing the Roman governor to appoint chief priests. Herod's going to be appointing the kings over it too. And so, like I said, you got Herod the Great that was over the whole area, but then when he died, Herod divided that up into a bunch of his different sons. And so, there was a bunch of different little mini kingdoms within there of the different kings that were ruling and reigning. And so when Herod Agrippa II, this guy, started to take over for his father, he was too young to really take over that kingdom. So it's kind of like, okay, we're going to give part of this to, your uncle, and, part of it to this guy over here. And when you get old enough, then we're going to give you a little bit more. And so now that he's old enough, he's getting more, and he probably wants a whole lot more than that. Okay? So does that explain it?
Caesar is the emperor.
Yes. Yep. He's the big guy.
Hail Caesar.
Not God, but he thought he was God, and he wanted a lot of people to think he was God too. But Caesar's the big guy, Nero in this case.
And she just asked who appointed Caesar, because they're not voted in.
Nope.
It's just the next son.
Well, it's going to be the next son, or really a lot of times I think in Roman, the way the Romans worked, it's whoever grabbed the falling crown first. So I think maybe some Caesars had sons succeed him, but I think the majority of them were military commanders, that finagled their way in grabbing the title. And I don't remember if it was the Senate that would, appoint them. But I mean, it was, yeah.